Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Member Spotlight from the Caribbean Coalition Against Trafficking in Persons. My name is Adrian Alexander, Caribbean Regional Coordinator for Free the Slaves and co-chair of the Membership Committee of the Caribbean Coalition Against Trafficking in Persons. With us today is someone who is from Belize. Now, we've interviewed people from multiple parts of the CARICOM, and really, this is our first time meeting someone from the Western CARICOM member
Yes.
state of Belize. So, Diana Shaw is our guest this morning. She is representing the Child Development Foundation of Belize, an organization she herself established. So we'll find out a little bit more about Diana. When you hear her speak, you would realize that that is not a Belizean accent. So you'll get into why that is not a Belizean accent and how someone with that accent has come to Belize to do such tremendous work in child protection. So, hello, Diana.
Good
Welcome to Member
morning.
Spotlight.
Thank you for having me. That's a delight and a joy to be here.
It's great to have you. And that accent, as we just mentioned, that is not an accent from Trinidad and Tobago,
No, it is
as much
not.
as not from Belize. Tell us a bit more about who is
So,
Diana and where is she from?
what you're hearing is my Jamaican accent. I hope you still hear it because sometimes Jamaicans tell me I'm losing the accent.
No,
It's
I hear
becoming
it.
more Belizeanized. So, I am originally from Jamaica. I am an attorney at law by profession. And when I finished law school, I had this desire to work overseas. I said, I'm young, I should travel and live somewhere else for a while. I sent out a lot of applications to different countries, narrowed it down to three countries where I had offers from BVI, Cayman, and Belize. Eventually choosing Belize, I felt it would be an adventure. I'd never been there. I learned about Belize in school, and it seemed like somewhere exotic and somewhere I think I would enjoy a year or two. So I came originally to Belize to practice law on a 2-year contract and very quickly fell in love with Belize.
Oh,
Belize, though it sits on in Latin America, we would say, because it's part of the joining between Mexico, Central America, and migration corridor. And so we are connected by land to Mexico and to Guatemala and Honduras. But we do face the Caribbean Sea. So our western border is the Caribbean Sea. And so we are still considered a part of the Caribbean. And it has a lot of similarities to Jamaica, the food, the culture, even the dialect that is spoken here, the Belize Creole is very similar to the Jamaican patois. So I immediately felt at home. The
great.
country received me very warmly. I experienced and built a new community here, but then also began to see the challenges that the country and persons living here were faced in relation to exposure to trafficking. Because of where Belize is situated, it is actually a part of the most active migration corridor in the world. The movement of people from South America towards the north is something that is historic for thousands of years. We have had persons moving through this area. And that movement is not necessarily following any border. People are moving just because they're trying to get usually to the US, to family, to work opportunities. And because the traditional pathways are there, the traffickers have seized upon the opportunity to make money from this movement by promising to facilitate that movement to get people across borders quickly, to help them to get documents. There are various groups of traffickers that will tell people that they can get them jobs, they will arrange for places for them to stay. And in return, people should pay them a small fee, or if they don't have the money, they could work on along the way to get the money for their passage. And because some of the countries in this region have experienced some upheaval, we had El Salvador many years ago, became very unsafe because of gang violence. People wanted to move. They wanted to go somewhere else to start over, to keep their children safe. They wanted opportunities for work. And so these kinds of lures were acceptable to them. Even though the risk was high, many persons, for instance, who are coming from Nicaragua and places further south have to go through the Dorian Gap in Panama, which is extremely unsafe. It's very physically challenging terrain. But they thought of getting to family, starting over a new life, opportunities for dreams that they felt could not be accomplished in their home country, drove many of them to take the chance. And because it has always been a traditional movement pathway, people expect that they will find services along the way. They expect that if they will find a church, they will find a clinic, they will find places where they could rest because they know that this is a traditional pathway. In fact, most of the countries in Central America do not require passports for border movement. You can move with your cellular, which is your national ID that you are born with, because the countries recognize this traditional movement. So if you are coming from as far as Ecuador, you could move all the way up to Belize without a passport. It's actually when you reach Belize would be the first country that would require you to enter using a passport because Belize does not recognize a cellular for international travel. But most of those other countries do. So because of that, people accept when the coyotes tell them, oh, you don't need to get a passport. You can join the movement of people and the caravan and we'll get you through the borders. You'll pay a small fee, bring your cellular. We will take the cellular for you to ensure that we keep it safe and we get you across the border. People accept that and it's not questioned. So people, large numbers of people, thousands of people do that all the time. And the coyotes have recognized that that creates a business opportunity for them because at the same time that people want to move, there are also people that have nefarious intent that feel that if somebody is young, especially female, but also men, young men as well, that there may be opportunities to get an additional money by trafficking them, whether it's for sex work, domestic work, or labor in construction and plantations and different kinds of activities. So many times these persons are giving their documents to these persons that they have been told are persons who facilitate travel, but these persons are usually also linked to the trafficking networks because the trafficking networks pay them to look for people that would make good candidates. And they get money when they get these people into the system and then cipher them off to the traffickers. So it is
So,
always a risk. And
so
this is what
Diana,
has happened.
you starting in Belize, how many years ago was that?
We started CDF in 2008 formally, but it actually started before that. I came here as an attorney, and
Hmm.
very quickly, people started to come to me to ask for help with migration issues. Their child was detained. They didn't know, understand because the language barrier issues, what to do to navigate forms and processes. And I actually supported the government back in 2003 to set up what we call legal information bureaus to give information on migration, general access to courts, to justice, because a lot of people coming from those other countries that are completely different justice system and didn't understand. So people came to recognize me as somebody that could give information about legal systems and could help. So when I left my full-time practice and the company that brought me here, people were still coming to me for help. And I started doing educational outreaches in migrant communities, in rural communities, educating people about the risk, explaining to them the proper procedures for the migrant processes, not allowing giving monies for coyotes for things that they didn't need to pay for. And so that is really how CDF started. I did that for several years. And then when the work became too much for just me, I formally incorporated in 2008 and started the Child Development Foundation. A lot of our initial focus was on preventing trafficking of children. There was a lot of issues with people just sending their children through the migrant caravan. They would literally pack up their 5, 10, 12-year-old children and just send them with a group of strangers, pay the coyotes some money, and with the hope that they will meet somebody in Belize or somebody in Mexico who is a relative who will help them with the rest of the journey. This was very dangerous, and a lot of children became missing. We had a lot of issues with that, with trafficking, some children who were sexually assaulted. We had a lot of issues in addition to those international issues with domestic trafficking, with rural communities in Belize, where people were actually going into those communities looking for families with large numbers of children, offering to help with school fees and to relocate children to better opportunities in other parts of the country or even in other countries, and then giving the parents incentives with monies to get them to agree or to sign fake documents to give them guardianship of the children, and then the children will disappear. The government recognized this was happening, and I supported some initial research on the vulnerability of the child protection system and vulnerability of children back in 2004 that actually documented this. And so it became something that became a burden for me, that this was something I felt I was being called to address. I had all of this information from the research, from the community outreach, from the persons who were coming to me. I actually went out into churches in the communities where there was no NGO and trained churches and persons in the churches how to do basic identification and reporting and to help people. And then I realized I needed to formalize the structure so that I could be more intentional about the interventions. And so in 2008, we formally registered CDF as a nonprofit organization. Since then, the organization has grown way beyond what I initially thought it could do or would do. And the organization has championed the protection of children, helping to shape policies for the protection of girls, especially helping to frame legislation to address commercial sexual exploitation of children, helping to train social workers, magistrates, to work with police. And we have continued to do work with migrants. We have actually supported and advocated for the asylum process in Belize and registered persons in that. So I think that that initial tug, that I think it was definitely God that pulled at my heart to say that this is something I'm calling you to respond, eventually led me away from my full-time practice. I came here to practice law so that I could buy a house on the beach and a red BMW. That was my dream as an attorney. And then I
I like
started
the color.
interacting.
Red BMW.
Yes, that was very specific. And then I started interacting in the communities and doing this work and realized this is what I'm actually supposed to be doing, and made a complete shift. From that, the law firm released me from the contract, allowed me to pursue my dream. And this is how CDF has come to be the organization that it is now, has done no work in Belize. Some of the things that it has done as staggering to me, because I never thought we would have ever been to this place. But when I look back, we have started programs in schools. We do prevention programs. We do the Rise Girls Club, which I will talk a little bit about, but that's one of the flagship programs we started to educate young people about the risks, about trafficking and other child protection issues. We have had over 10,000 girls pass through that program in the last 10 years. We have partnered with UNICEF, with the government, with IOM, with UNFPA to implement these programs, and other initiatives that we have done in addressing teenage pregnancy, looking at the vulnerability for commercial sexual exploitation, addressing child marriage. These are some of the issues that we have championed in Belize.
Wow, Diana. I think the fulfillment that you would feel just to see all of that work being done, and knowing that you could have been in Jamaica or in BVI or in the Cayman Islands and not be having these experiences to be impacting people, because you're a migrant in
Yes,
Belize. So it's impacting the lives of people just like yourself.
yes.
Um, you mentioned legislation. So let's delve a little bit there.
Mhm.
Can you probably share a couple of pieces of legislation where CDF would have assisted in terms of either bringing it to fruition or perhaps amending and updating legislation?
Yeah. So I think very earlier on, when I did the research on the vulnerability analysis in 2004, we identified that child marriage was an issue for Belize. I encountered a lot of situations in rural communities where parents were brokering marriages for teenage girls as soon as they reached 14. At that time, the age for marriage was 14. Parents could consent to their 14-year-old being married, And I was disturbed by that when I had conversations with the government about why that was. I was told that that was an accommodation for some of our indigenous communities where the onset of puberty was traditionally considered as the beginning of adulthood. So we started to do a lot of education in indigenous communities to educate parents about the risk that this was, because we saw the pattern that a lot of these girls at 14 were being pushed into marriage with men who were in their 40s, in their 50s, even in their 60s. We saw a lot of issues with domestic violence that happened. We saw a lot of issues with high rates of STDs that followed, the girls having very difficult pregnancies in their teenage years, some of them developing cervical cancer. There was a host of issues that were happening that there was actually medical evidence to support. So we use that a lot in the community education processes to educate communities. I recall being in sessions where was cussed out. I mean, I remember one man telling me, I don't raise his children and I can't tell him what to do in his community. So
Conditions
thankfully,
are
I am
hard to die,
Jamaican.
right?
So, things like that don't faze us. And I would push back and say, well, what you're doing is counterproductive because you're sending your child into a domestic violence situation where somebody may
Mhm.
kill her before she's old enough to work to support you in your old age. So you are
Wow.
pushing her into a situation where you think that she's going to be in a marriage where she's going to be safe and help you in your old age, where she could probably be dead before that happens. So
Wow.
I had a lot of those kinds of conversations. That some of it was quite confrontational. I think fresh from Jamaica, it was very confrontational. But I think it was helpful because they saw that I was genuinely concerned. Like this wasn't something I was doing because I was trying to get a project for my NGO or to get money for the NGO. That the concern was genuine, and
Right.
that was something that people resonated with a lot, even though I was from a completely different ethnicity, didn't
Mhm.
speak the language, but the genuineness was there. And so we were well received in those communities that after the initial pushback, and we would go back again and they would realize, okay, she's not going away, she's going to keep coming. Apparently has nothing else to do.
Consistency is
Yes.
so important in this work, Diana, and you
Yes.
definitely have demonstrated that.
So eventually they start listening. And then the conversation started to change. Instead of saying, I can't tell them to do this, they would say, okay, but what if we want to send them to school? There is no school. What are they going to do? Like they started to become more open to alternatives. Then
Right.
we worked to get sponsorship through churches for some children. And that started to open up the way for others. We had some churches that went in and started to do a lot of mission work in some of those areas and provided scholarships. Then the government came and started to build schools and to create opportunities for girls to be in school. And so we saw a huge shift in the culture where when I started this work and started those community outreaches back in 2004, hardly any girls in those communities were in school. Now it's almost the reverse, where a lot of those schools now have more girls than boys. So now we'll have to go back to do some more work to get the boys back in school. But it has been a tremendous blessing to see that. We have also been able to get one of the things that we did very early was to get community advocates and train them to go back to be the change agents in their communities, because I realized I didn't speak Quechua, which is the indigenous language in some of the rural communities in the south. I didn't speak Maya, Mopan Maya, which is from the Mopan Maya in the north. So there was always a disconnect, because when you are communicating to people in a language that is not their parent language and relying on a translator to give the information, some things get lost in translation. So the focus became training people in local communities to be the advocates and change agents. That was very successful in changing community dynamics. And then we built advocacy with the government that maybe it's time to consider changing the law if they are serious about getting the population educated. You say one of the goals is ensuring more people are in school. This is a barrier to them being in school. So you will have to raise the age for marriage and you'll have to address that. So in 2005, the government did raise the age for marriage to 16, moved it from 14 to 16 to make it comparative with the rest of the Caribbean, which was good. and it assisted in getting a lot of girls in school, and parents were then forced to get them in school because before there was no reason to send them to school, or no incentive for that. Now they were. The government's program of building schools in indigenous communities, the openness of some of the indigenous community leaders to now have schools and support education of girls, that started to shift. And then that now created the cultural change that we had been praying and really been pushing to see. But the vulnerability was still there. The vulnerability arises because, one, economic situations. We do have a lot of families with large numbers of children. And even though the government created more schools, the school, especially for secondary school, was not free. So you could go to school, but only if you could pay the school fee. And we had families in the South that have 6, 7 children, typically. That's a lot, and they're all close in age because they tend to start young and they have a child every year. So they will have 4 children at the same time that need to be in high school. That's a lot of money for families.
So true.
So that became a challenge. And so the risk for trafficking still continued, even though we saw the cultural attitudes will change. We saw that people were more responsive to educating girls. The risk was still there, and perpetrators were still taking advantage of that. So our work still had to continue. We supported the government in 2008 to develop a legislation. I actually drafted the legislation to prohibit
Really.
commercial sexual exploitation of adolescents and to make that a crime, because before it wasn't a crime because they were saying, oh, there are all of these cultural issues and we don't want to be have
Ah,
any political pushback. But when we were, because we had done all that education in the communities, and some other organizations, Tide and some of those other organizations working in indigenous communities were also doing similar education outreaches, the culture was shifting. People were beginning to question this. When we would go to communities, we would have people share their experiences. Women would share about things that happened to them because they got married at 14, and the years of domestic violence that they had to endure, the hardships, and how they lost their dreams of going to school and what they wanted to do and what they were going to do differently for their children. I would do a lot of those kinds of testimonials in the communities. So
survivors'
people were
voices are
hearing.
essential,
Yes,
Diana.
they were
Essential.
hearing from the survivors, hearing from persons who had been through that and wanting to choose a different way for their children. And then people were moving away from the indigenous communities into Belmopan, into the Kaya district for other opportunities. And because they were moving, they were more willing to change the cultural practices, that the traditions within the home, in the context of where they were living, would have been harder to step out of. And so that was shifting the culture a lot. So we took advantage of that. We are headquartered in the Kaya district, and a lot of the indigenous population from the south actually are family members in the Kaya district because a lot of people come here for work. So we did a lot of work in the communities where we know these families lived, where we know migrants were settling, to get them to think about changing the perception, changing the community dynamics. We have a lot of conversations about what is culture and what is harmful traditional practice, the difference between honoring your culture and not giving in to harmful traditional practice, the way that you can still honor your culture but raise your children differently. We have a lot of those kinds of conversations in communities because we are very intentional about getting people to think differently about things that are harmful.
But
And we have
Diana, those are
seen,
conversations that we need to have across the Caribbean.
yes,
Um, in every jurisdiction that I've done, like training up social workers primarily, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica, Eastern Caribbean, we always bring up the point of culture.
yes,
Because at the 2024 Caribbean Regional Forum in Jamaica, that was the sub-theme. How is
mhm,
culture being used to either perpetrate or can be used to prevent human trafficking? And if we don't have these discussions and identify that there is a way to honor your culture without harming the vulnerable people within your community, and then to be able to push that shift. And it has to come from government, but even as you're saying, it really starts with the people who are embedded in the culture, being
yes,
able to understand the distinction showing government that they are in favor of a shift because governments operate on election cycles, right?
Correct.
And
That is so
regardless of
true.
how positive a shift may be, their concern will always be, will I lose the next election if I do this? So when people are able to stand up and say, yes, this is what we want, and we want you to fund this, and we want you to support this, then, change begins to accelerate. But it really is a conversation that we need to have across the culture, the male entitlement to sex. And as you mentioned, the culture allowed 40, 50, 60-year-old men to have
Mm-hmm.
access to the bodies of teens,
Yes.
barely teens at 14, barely
Mm.
teen girls. And that is something that has to be broken,
Yep.
right? So I applaud this. Let me hush and let you continue, but I just want to stick that in because it's a
No,
discussion that we need to have across our region.
agreed. I fully agreed, and that's I think part of what has just keep driving me to continue to do that. It's a conversation that always continues because regardless of how much awareness and sensitization that we have done, culture, I always say it moves in a cycle, like it's cyclical. You have change and people are going good, and then they revert back. And then you have to push them again to come to change, and then they revert back. And then, so I have seen that in the 26 years now that I've been here doing this. So we
So
constantly have to go back, and new people come into the communities, the persons who were the champions, they die or they move away, and then things revert back, and then you have to push again to get the cultural shift that you know is going to be protective for the young people. But you have to keep at it. So that's one of the things that the persistence, I think, is probably one of our strongest traits. Because of that persistence, we were able to get the government to recognize that draft legislation. So I drafted that legislation in 2008. It was eventually passed into law in 2013. And the government, yeah, it took a lot of time to convince the government that this is something that would not have political backlash.
And that's a 5-year period of time. So that's an election
Yes,
cycle.
exactly.
That's an election
That's what
cycle.
happened. Yes.
Yeah. Mhm.
So then it was passed, and then we were one of the main agencies going across the country educating people on the legislation, training attorneys, judges, police, and what this will mean. Because now police work will have to change. Something that they weren't
Correct.
investigating before as a crime was now a crime. How they were going to deal with this. We had quite a bit of resistance from the police, honestly, because some of them did not want to deal with these kinds of issues that they felt was going into family, people's private lives, so it would be too messy. That police should not be doing this, social workers should be doing that. There was some kind of pushback from that. But I think when the police started actually doing it and they saw, because it's one thing to hear about the cases and to have a romantic idea of, this older person taking care of this younger, because in the Caribbean we talk about sugar daddy and we think that this is a kind of a romantic idea. But when you're actually
Um,
faced with a case and you are hearing the story of this 16-year-old who has three children at 16, I remember a young girl I had an
mm,
intervention with was 22 and had five children.
wow.
She had five children by the time she was 22. So she
With
started
no
at 13.
twins.
Yes,
Oh,
without twins.
13.
Yes.
No.
So when you start to hear these stories and you understand the devastation that these women are experiencing, you can't be impersonal
No.
and just a bystander and an observer anymore. So when the police started investigating these cases, now they realize that this is something that is very serious. So they did a lot of training with the domestic violence unit to get them equipped and get them more exposed to the social work aspect of it, how to work to barriers in communities, and how to ensure that they're the ones championing the protection. So we have seen much more responsiveness. We have seen cases that have gone to court. Actually, the first trafficking conviction that ever occurred in Belize was one of those cases. So it's
Great.
important to push the envelope, to push for legislative
Mhm,
change,
mhm.
because it changes the norms, right? Legislation is important in changing norms, in
Correct.
helping people to see that something that we may have accepted all the time really is harmful. We can do differently. It won't destroy our culture. It will actually lead to more protection for people in our community. So
But
we
that
have been able to
legislation
be
has to be enforced, Diana, and that
always
enforcement has to be consistent, Diana.
and funded. So
And
that
yes,
is now the issue that I
definitely.
think Belize has. We have good legislation, but not enough funding for the police to actually do the work that they need to do. So
Wow.
we have seen some gaps in the enforcement response as a result. But what
But
we have
what?
done since then is to work in schools because we continue to believe that cultural shift is the most important way to
Yeah.
change harmful traditional practices. So we have now we started the Rise Clubs in 2013, the same year that legislation was passed. And we work with the Ministry of Education to do life skill curriculum support activities in schools where we go in and we do sessions with girls. We create safe spaces for them to talk about challenges they're having. But then we also do educational sessions with the classes where we talk about adolescent development, challenges that adolescents go through, adolescent girls, adolescent boys, including risk for trafficking, abuse, drug use, dating. We talk about a lot of these issues with the children, and then we do companion sessions with the parents to get them to also think
Yeah.
about these things differently, how to be more supportive. And then we do sessions with the teachers about how they can incorporate this learning into the curriculum and into the everyday
Nice.
space of the school. So that has continued. We did that full time for 10 years. We started in
Wow.
2013 and it ended in 2014, 2024.
Very-
UNICEF cycle changed. And then
Okay.
when the funding was lost in 2025, early 2025, they could not continue the program anymore. So,
Mhm.
but the school still wanted us to come in. So last year we made a shift to develop an abridged curriculum for teachers. And then now we
Nice.
provide like virtual mentoring support for parents. And so we've been doing that, and we continue to do it to encourage girls. We now have, as I said, over 10,000 girls that have been through that program in the 10 years that we have do it. So we are using those girls now to be champions for other girls coming up and
Right.
encouraging them to be good role models and to
Mhm.
change their parenting practices, because now most of them are adults now
Oh,
that come through that program,
correct.
to
You
change
said
their
it's called
parenting practices.
RISE. Is RISE an acronym?
Yes, reviving initiatives supporting and engaging girls. Rise girls.
Okay. RISE
Yes.
Girls. Nice. You have Rise Girls. Is there a similar program that you've developed for boys, especially as you mentioned that you're seeing many boys dropping out from the school attendance and is more predominantly girls attending? Do you have like a male
So
or young male
we
focus
have
program?
done some out of school focus on boys, but the primary flagship program is the girls, Rise Girls program.
Right.
CDF's main beneficiary target is women and girls, right? We are
Okay.
recognized as a women's rights organization, but of course, we know that women's rights don't exist in a vacuum. We need men to be
Mhm.
championing, supporting, and we also know that men have vulnerabilities. I think though that we need a male-driven organization to do that. I am always, when I go into sessions and I'm talking to boys, they will say, they hear a lot because a lot of them are in single mother homes. They have a mother telling them something, a teacher who is a female telling them
Yeah.
something. Now I am coming telling them something more.
Yeah.
They don't hear
Have you
enough
con
from men.
have you
So
considered working with similar to how you've developed a program for like the teachers to integrate into their school curriculums and so on, something maybe for people who are youth pastors or people who are
yes, we have
coaches
done
for
that. Yes,
athletic
yes.
clubs and so
Yes,
forth.
we have done that. That's another program
Great.
that we have done. Again, funding for that was last. UNICEF was supporting that, where we were training pastors, and most of those were men. One, because we needed to train them not to do child marriages. So
Great. Yeah.
we
As
did a
marriage
whole
officers.
curriculum and training component for pastors, senior JPs, and persons who were marriage officers, so that when people come to them to try to get them to perform child marriages, they would not perform those marriages. They would be able to
Right.
educate them about trafficking, about the risk, and then refer them to services. And then they would also create support in their churches for vulnerable women, identify focal points in the churches who persons would know that they could go to if they were facing violence, domestic violence, they were being pressured by their family member into trafficking activities, or facing child protection challenges. So we have done training, and by now we have reached, I think, over 1,000 pastors since we started that with UNICEF. But again, the funding for that was disrupted in 2025 when we lost all of our funding that year for all of our programs. So all of those
Wow.
things are now, we'll have to figure out different ways of doing it. We have petitioned the Attorney General's ministry, who actually does the licensing for persons who do marriages, that this should be a course that should be added to the licensing, that when
Certainly.
somebody is applying as a church leader to be a marriage officer, that they should be required to go through this.
Mhm.
They are open to it, but somebody has to develop the online course, so they will have to find funding for that, because it would be ideal if they had a self-paced online course that people
Right.
could go through, so that they could do that. I think that that is key, because even though and so the second thing that CDF also promoted, when the legislation changed to 16, we still weren't satisfied, because we always had a vision that it should be 18. But there's only one other Caribbean country, I think, that has at 18. Everybody else still has 16, and nobody wants to change it. So there wasn't really any pressure on Belize to change it. But the advocacy from us, a lot of other organizations started advocating for this, because people were seeing all the things that were happening to young girls. The AIDS statistics, STD statistics was spiking in the young population of females, and it was directly related to this practice. So BFLA and those other organizations that champion HIV and protection, they started speaking out against this. YES, that works with teen moms, was sharing how they were seeing more teen moms and younger teen moms. And so they were advocating as well that we need to consider changing the law, because a lot of parents were still pushing into marriages, young girls at 16, where the girls were saying they didn't really want to do it, but the parent telling them they have to get married. And the parents were the ones that were required to consent, because at 16, your parents consent for you, not you. So we wanted to change that. So that advocacy from the NGOs continued. And then the National Committee for Families and Children took it on when they saw that there was public support for it. And they pushed for the legislative change. And in 2024, November, the government passed legislation to abolish child marriage completely. So since November 2024, nobody in Belize can be married until they're 18 years old. So parents can no
Awesome.
longer consent to any
Yes.
marriage of any child. So child marriage is over, but we still
Hmm.
have the issues with early union, which comes from the cultural practices of parents brokering relationships for adolescents. So CDF's work has shifted to work with parents to ensure that they are not pushing their teenagers into relationships or abdicating their responsibility to parent
Right.
their teenagers, to say, well, she don't have a man now, so if she want to live with him, that's a fair problem, which is some of the feedback we have seen happening in some of the communities. And then the girls move out and to go to live with somebody who is 30 at the age of 16 and drop out of school. So the work now is out of school population. And so we are working with both girls and boys for that, because we also have a lot of 16, 17-year-old boys who are dropping out of school to start families. And at that age, most of the work they
Families
can get
with family
with girls, with young
around the
girls.
same age group. Oh,
Yes.
okay. Okay.
Yeah. So that is something that we are now heavily focused on, the out of school population, educating them on the need to pursue their educational goals. There are more opportunities now for education than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
The government is paying for more free education. We want them to take advantage of this. But for many teenagers, the challenge that we're seeing now, so this is another cultural shift that has happened. A lot of teenagers know there's a heavy, I think because of social media, they want to be independent, they want to be on their own, they want to be free of school. There is this idea that school is not important, it's not going to help you to do what you want to do with your life anyway, because people are on TikTok making millions of dollars. You should just try to find a good TikTok handle and make some videos. Why should you be studying in school? That's a cultural thing that is happening, not just in Belize. We have seen that in the other parts of the Caribbean as well amongst our teenagers. Education is being devalued, and staying in
So
school
true.
for extended periods of time to learn is something that since COVID, children don't want to do anymore. Because COVID kept them out of school and they were online, they know of the idea, well, we can just do something online and do a course. Why should we have to go to school every day? And
Mhm.
so parents are struggling to keep children in school. Schools are struggling to keep children focused on their educational goals, because there's so much other things now competing for the time and the attention of adolescents. So we have shifted to that out of school population to try to re-engage them, and then to work with those who are in school for school retention, to keep them in school, to keep them focused. This week, we're doing sessions through many schools on goal setting, helping them to figure out, okay, what you want to do with your life, why education is important, but also getting them to see education as broader than just going to school. Because I think that's
Correct.
also one of the shifts that the government has to make, which
Yeah.
it hasn't really been good at making, that we have to emphasize more vocational education, pay vocational training appropriately, help children to develop more skills-based learning. I think the way we're teaching academics is not really helpful for the generation of children that we have now, who are so much more computer literate than their teachers, than their parents, and feel that the reading all day a book in school is not helpful because they're telling me they could download ChatGPT and write this essay that the teacher want them to write in 5 minutes. They don't know why the teacher want them to sit down and write this foolishness. They could be doing something else with their time. So it's
Well, let's switch gears a bit because I know from the Caribbean Anti-Trafficking Conference last year, in which you and others from Belize participated, there is a CSO coalition
yes.
against trafficking in persons. And I believe that CDF, the Child Development Foundation,
Yes,
is
we
a
helped to
member
form
of
it.
that.
Yes.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit
Yes.
about
So
what you do within that context
all
for
right.
the
So
coalition.
part of CDF's mission is also to multiply ourselves because we can't be everywhere and reach everyone. So we want to develop the abilities of other stakeholders to be able to do work where they are. So we have always supported partnerships. We have partnered with YES a lot in the past years to implement projects and programs. And then
And
after
YES is an acronym
Youth
for,
Enhancement Services.
all right,
Sorry.
great. That's okay.
And then, so this actually started during COVID. When COVID happened, Belize, though it didn't have the high numbers that some of the other countries had, we were very heavily hit because all of our social workers and police were diverted from child protection, from domestic violence work into relief for COVID and supporting nurses and doctors. So you literally had nobody doing that. And so the government turned to NGOs and asked us, because we had all these community networks, that NGOs had to work together to fill the gap and to provide support to parents, to persons who were vulnerable, and provide basic services. So CDF was one of the main. We had CDF, YES, BFLA, Tide. I think it was about 5 of us across the country that were identified. CDF to cover the Cayo district because people had restriction on movement. They had to kind of put us where we were to cover areas within us. We got special permits from the government to be able to move around and became almost like essential workers so that we could go into communities and work with community leaders. Community leaders would be reporting to us about situations that we could respond to. We would activate responses and for the police and the medical sector and social workers, and do some of the preliminary work to get people prepared for those services. So that started during COVID. And it was also supported by the Spotlight Initiative. So we got funding to take on more people, to hire people and train community mobilizers to be able to do some of this work. Then after COVID ended, the partnerships continue. We continue to work with those NGOs to create that strong network. And because we were doing that during COVID, that's how we survive. If we got a call about something in Belize City, we would be calling YES for them to activate somebody on the ground in that area to go to help the person. They would be sending referrals to us. That's how we actually survived during COVID to work on issues that the government services could not take on. So that partnership continued after COVID and was formalized when RET International, an international NGO, received funding to provide support to Belize to develop SOP for shelters and facilities that provided accommodation services for trafficked persons, but also to build the capacity of the local networks and the local NGOs to respond effectively at the community level. And CDF was identified as a key aid because we were already doing that. We were able to mobilize the NGOs that had already been working with us since COVID into the coalition, and we had 14 members that joined, and we were able to support policy reform, the new legislation for trafficking. The CSOs gave significant input from their experience and things on the ground. We developed the SOPs with RET and for the government that the government validated to classify services and accommodation arrangements in shelters, to harmonize services and to set minimum standards for services. And we provided training to the members on the actual support to survivors, so to provide the trauma-informed care and some of those things, as well as some of the self-care needs, because especially after COVID, a lot of our NGOs were burnt out. We had been on the ground without a break since 2020 and with minimum staff, doing work that the government really should be doing, but without the capacity of the government. And so there, a lot of people were tired and burnt out. And so we were able to provide some self-care and some support. We were able to help some of them to formalize registration, get their documentation and legal processes together. But then the funding ended again in 2025. That was one of the programs that was funded by USAID, and so it was canceled. And so since then, we have maintained our loose network that we always had and still referring to each other. But a lot of our NGOs in this sector have lost all their staff. Have lost, we have had like Help for Progress, which is key for the protection of persons who are refugees. They have lost literally all of their funding. All of those persons have been released. We have had several other NGOs that are down to like one or two persons. We lost a significant portion of our staff as well. We were able to survive a little bit longer than some of the other NGOs because we had a lot of local businesses that have supported us over the years and churches that have supported us. And when the funding from the grants ended, a lot of them step up to cover some of the basic programs that we were doing so that those programs would continue. But it is a very difficult time now for NGOs that are working in whether it's human rights protections, child protections, or migrant protections that were dependent on funding from programs that were funded by USAID. And actually, USAID funded a lot of IOM's programs, so a lot of the migration programs have been canceled. We don't know when those programs, if they will ever come back. So it is a very challenging time, I think, for NGOs. We have certainly seen it. The government amnesty that was done in 2022, CDF supported over 800 persons in terms of filling out forms for them and mobilizing them to be registered. And we paid for over 120 registration applications with funding from UNICEF and IOM primarily. Now we have all of those persons who have been newly registered who now need integration services. And the plan was for IOM to provide integration services, but when the program was canceled, they have not been able to do that. We have had to try to fill some of the gap with some of the local support. So now we're doing skills training for women, sewing classes. We're going to start an ESL virtual shortly so that more women can participate. So we are trying to provide those services. We have been helping them to get Social Security, navigate school registration, birth registration, and other things that they now need to do now that they're legal in the country. All of these other things that you now need to do. But it has been difficult without the funding. So we have had to be relying on local donors. Unfortunately, not everyone can get help if we don't have the funding. So do we have a long wait list of people that still need help? But I think that we are determined to see this through. I know that CDF is not going anywhere. We're never ever going to be closing our doors. We are going to find a way to survive and to help people as best as we can. But a lot of our board members have been pouring their own personal finances into the organizations. We have now, I think, turned a corner, so to speak, because we were just yesterday receiving happy news that we were selected for a UNODC grant that we had applied for.
Awesome.
So
Great,
that will
great,
help
great.
to cover some of those services that are pending. We have some outstanding grant applications for Commonwealth Foundation grants and some other grants. UNFPA has now contacted us again that they're going to be re-engaging us this year to do some work in communities, rural communities around
Great.
the adolescent protection needs. So that's also good. We will be able to get back into our communities, re-engage our community mobilizers and provide some training for them and other organizations at the grassroots level through that grant. So we have We're not fully back to where we were pre-January 2025, but we are much more hopeful that things will work out. The shelter was temporarily closed because we lost all the funding for that from the grant in 2025. So we are going to be reopening this year. We have been doing some significant fundraising on the ground, and local businesses have been pledging their support. So
So if
it's been
someone,
a journey.
right, so if someone across the region would like to get in touch with CDF to say, look, we are interested in supporting your work, or we have capacity to do A, B, and C that can fit nicely with what you are doing. How do they get in touch with you? Do you have like an
We have a
WhatsApp number
website.
and email?
They
Ah,
can
great.
engage us through our website,
Hmm.
www.cdfbelize.org. We
Okay,
have
CDF, please.
WhatsApp 501, which is area code for Belize, 615-7010. We are on Facebook. We're very active on Facebook, CDF
Great.
Belize. They can look for our handle there. They can reach us through all of those mechanisms. And then we can discuss the process for them of partnership, and then we can go through engaging that.
Thank you so much, Diana. You have really blessed us with a wealth of information to get most of us in the CARICOM to understand more about what's happening with our neighbors to the west. And really seeing that there's been grit, tenacity, determination, and commitment to bring CDF into fruition in the first place, and certainly to have it remaining open despite all of the different challenges, financial challenges, as well as staffing and so forth. But thank you so much for your time, Diana. And it has really been a blessing chatting with you, and all the best of success to CDF. Great news that UNODC funding
Yeah.
has been finalized, and I'm trusting that all of the other applications that you've submitted, you will get good reports from those as well.
Yes.
All right. So enjoy the
Thank
rest
you
of your
so
day and
much.
thank you so much. So those of you who've been watching, thank you so much for taking the time to view Member Spotlight. You've been chatting with Ms. Diana Shaw, founder of the Child Development Foundation of Belize. You'll be able to get in touch with her on the contact information that she shared. We'll put it in the video so that you'll be able to reach out and provide whatever support you can to CDF and the work that they are doing in Belize. Thanks so much for watching and continue looking at some of our other podcast episodes in this series, Member Spotlight. For now, I'm Adrian Alexander, thanking you for viewing. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.